Urvarukamiv bandhanam
Hi, this is Bill Ryan from Project Avalon, recording this at the very end of the day on the 11th of September 2015. And I wanted to make this introduction to this most interesting interview with Rebekah Roth, the author of 2 books, Methodical Illusion, which is her first, and a sequel just out called Methodical Deception. And as we'll hear, she's already working on a third. Now, it's an interesting interview because some of you listening right now, you know all about Rebekah and her most important research into what really happened on 9/11, and I'd even call it groundbreaking. And then some of you may know really very little about who she is. So that's why I'm doing this introduction, which I recorded after the interview, which was yesterday, to try and cater for the possibly very broad spectrum knowledge base of the listeners here. Because some of you may know nothing about her, some of you will already have heard her interviewed maybe several months ago, and some of you may even have read both of her books and already be very familiar with the huge mass of pretty much hard fact that she's uncovered or deduced with really a very great deal of confidence. And in my very strong personal opinion, she has the story pretty much exactly right in a lot of detail. And after all these years, I'd suggest that we all need to be listening really very carefully indeed. Now, here's the other problem. The story does not go in a straight line. There's a massive complexity here, which is why the entire backstory has remained unclear for so many years. So, please bear with Rebekah. She takes us on a journey to explore with her this extensive and multidimensional territory that she's uncovered. Now, as she explains, and as many of you already know, she was a flight attendant, a highly experienced one, of many years standing. And flight attendants know exactly what could and could not happen on a plane, especially at times of emergency. It's like we were waiting all these years but never knew it for a very experienced flight attendant like Rebekah to come along and lay it all out for us. And ironically, a very serious point, some of the flight attendants who made the famous cell phone calls on 9/11, which of course could only have been made from the ground, may very well have left clues in their messages which only another equally highly trained flight attendant would be able to decipher. And whether or not this was intentional on their part, deciphering what they have left us is exactly what Rebekah has done. So, in this interview, we'll hear how the planes were taken over by an installed flight termination system which remotely controls the planes, and when it's activated, there's nothing the pilots can do about it. In fact, they can't even communicate, not even with the cabin crew on the other side of the door. This renders all the pilots impotent to do anything about what's happening. And what did happen that day was that the 4 planes were remotely flown to Westover Air Base, just 20 or so minutes away, which has a long 10,000-foot runway, which is needed for planes which have got a heavy full load of fuel, and hangars large enough for C-5 transport planes, which are far larger than any 757 or 767. And in the interview that follows, Rebekah even reads us an affidavit from a local resident who contacted her after her first book was published and who saw a United Airlines passenger 757 flying into Westover that very morning, so low that she thought it might crash, exactly at the right time to fit. Soon after 8:30 in the morning, she was heading on her way out to an appointment, which is how come she knew what time it was. Soon after they landed, the planes were hidden in the hangars. The passengers may have been told this was all a drill. A couple of people were picked off each plane, taken to upstairs offices in the hangar, and they were told what to say on their cell phones. One flight attendant, C.C. Lyles, can even be heard being told, "You did great," at the very end of her call. Basically, it was all scripted, and some inevitable confusion on that morning can be seen inasmuch as some of the callers were seeming to get their stories confused with one another, almost as if they didn't really know for sure what plane they were meant to be on, as far as the theatre goes. Now, the ugly part of all this is that soon after this happened, the passengers would all have been murdered. The exception may have been one or two of the callers, but not any of the flight crew, who may have been in on the entire thing from the beginning and who may still be alive with new identities. Now, this intends no disrespect to any person or their families. It's just where the evidence leads. Now, there's even more to this, of course, because the evidence leads to a great deal of different places, but that's the core of Rebekah's first book, Methodical Illusion, where all this is laid out in the form of a detail-packed, easy-to-read novel. And her second book, just published, Methodical Deception, goes deeper into the tangled, interconnected labyrinth of who did all this and why and how. And it has to be said right up front that following the evidence faithfully, as Sherlock Holmes would have done, all roads lead to Israel and PNAC, P-N-A-C, the Project for a New American Century. Now, some of you may already know much of this, but Rebekah is a fluid, lively, and entertaining presenter, and I hope you may enjoy this as much as I did. If you're keen to know where all this may be going, then jump to nearer the end of the interview, where Rebekah shares her concerns about the role of artificial intelligence and the threat of another much more traumatic and large-scale false flag event, possibly a nuclear one, in which there may be not nearly so many mistakes made in its execution, and which may be far more destructive and game-changing. As she says, and I agree, and I think many of you will too, whether this happens or not, or the outcome of such an event, if this does happen, depends on you and me and the number of people who are awake and aware and who can understand exactly what is really going on. So do enjoy this conversation, and we'll start right here. This is Bill Ryan from Project Avalon, and it is the 10th of September, and I don't quite know what that means, but Rebekah, I do know that you're really shoehorning in a lot of interviews at the moment, kind of wall to wall, right?
Very much so. And I two things are going on: the 14th anniversary of 9/11, and the release of my second book, Methodical Deception. So that's a busy, crazy time. For me, my driving force in this, I kind of stumbled in onto the whole 9/11 thing. I just was going to write a novel about my exciting life as a 30-year flight attendant, international purser, and I was looking for a name for a Middle Eastern character, and I just Google searched 19 Arab hijackers 9/11, and up in front of me came the information that several of those guys were still alive. The Saudi government was suing the FBI and for stealing the identity of some of their citizens, and some of them were professional airline pilots. Well, that got my attention, and that was somewhere between 2008 and 9. I don't know. At that point, I put my novel aside. I just dove into researching what really did happen, because from day one, I knew there was no plane crash at the Pentagon. I could see that. I heard Jamie McIntyre at CNN say that. And I knew there was no plane parts there, because there would have been plane parts all over the outside of that building. The Pentagon had just been reinforced right where that plane supposedly hit with steel and Kevlar reinforcement. So An aluminum airplane isn't going to go in like a missile and leave a hole out the other side through all those rings of the Pentagon. And I knew that there was no plane crash at Shanksville because there was no plane crash there. And so when I discovered these hijackers were, accused hijackers were still alive, I dove into this and found every single solitary detail that I could find. My driving force was to find the planes, the passengers, and the crew members. And I did that in methodical illusion. And I wanted people to know. And there's been some really incredible, I guess, spiritual things that have happened since that book was released. I was offered nearly a terabyte of Freedom of Information Act data. And the researcher who had collected all of that said, wow, there's almost a terabyte full here. I'd need to have an external hard drive. I shipped one direct from Amazon to him and said, I'll pay the postage to wherever I'm at when you get it uploaded. And he did, and he Skyped me a screenshot. The postage was $9.11. And I knew right then and there that I was not the only one involved in this truth coming forward. So there may be some divine protection.
Maybe the angels were giving you a little message there. That's a lovely story.
I have a structural idea here, if I may suggest it. There may be some people here who aren't fully up to speed with your research journey, which has really been in 2 installments. And maybe you could start off by summarizing the findings that you portrayed in fictional form in your first book, which are many and extremely important. And then we can focus some of the time on the continuation of that journey in the second book. But we probably need to start with a kind of recap.
Sure, it's kind of a neat story, actually. I mean, like I said, I never wanted to be labeled as a truther or a conspiracy nut, and the airline is kind of like the military. It's there's things that you just don't want to ask questions about, and places you just don't want to go. So it was just such a strange thing. From day one, I saw things that weren't possible. And even now, I have airline pilots contacting me and say, have you figured out how they got that plane to fly into that building like a hot knife through butter? Because it's impossible, and we all know that. So from the very get-go, I saw things that were impossible. I heard people on the television saying things that were not possible. We had never been warned about Al-Qaeda as a group of hijackers. And I'd never heard of Osama bin Laden or Tim Osman, his CIA asset name. I just had never been warned about that. And every year we have a yearly training. And so if there's some hijackers or somebody that's making any kind of threat to the airline industry worldwide, because we've traveled around the world, they told us. So we knew their pictures and their names and that sort of thing. So I was really shocked when I saw it unfold. Luckily for me, I'd just gotten home from an international trip. And someone called me, and the minute I turned on my television, that message was, turn on the TV right now. And when I did, I saw what appeared to be a 767 fly into the South Tower and completely disappear. The wingtips, the wings, the tail. And I'm like, I thought it was do you remember the War of the Worlds thing that they did years ago on the radio, and it freaked people out like an alien invasion? I thought it was some kind of a fake terror attack, basically. I thought first the person who called me and said that was mind melting me with manipulating what was coming over my TV screen or something, because that is an impossibility. And so my mind, I was like, what is this? And to me, it just looked like trick photography. So as I woke up, jet-lagged and all, I was watching this and hearing these things. And another thing that happened to me was cell phones don't work at altitude. So when I was hearing the flight attendants and the pilots were calling in from their cell phones and these very emotion-filled telephone calls, and the fact that the passenger manifest was released really soon, these are all things that normally wouldn't happen. And so I saw a lot of things, but I was in what's referred to as cognitive dissonance. I didn't want to know the truth. And actually, since I was flying, and we really weren't allowed to ask questions about it, and they sure didn't want any information about holes in the security that we as employees saw. One of the things I did in Methodical Illusion is I wanted to bring the reader into that world of being inside the airline and being a flight attendant, And so that people understood how we check in for a flight. And the reason I did this and how we all, as a crew, walk to the aircraft that we're going to work. That's very different than showing up for a flight as a passenger. And the reason I did that is as I started into my research, I saw a lot of retired professors and people that knew nothing about the airline industry making just insane conspiracy theories about our lifestyle and our how we would get to work and what we would do. So I wanted people to be able to literally walk in with Vera Hansen, the protagonist, the senior flight attendant on the story, so they would understand what she goes through, how she briefs her crews and has a crew briefing with everyone she's going to work with, how they all walk to the plane together. So it's impossible to be kidnapped inside of a secure airport. And I read that theory by some lunatic that wrote this. And I was like, what kind of crazy nonsense? So there's a lot of stuff in Methodical Illusion that is done so that you understand as a reader how some of those conspiracy theories were pretty wild and crazy, like the voice morphing, the girls were kidnapped on the way to the planes, and all of that stuff. So I set out when I did this research, and I just kept charts and notes and just stuff. I found so much stuff that I thought, well, how would I ever deliver all what I found after thousands of hours of looking into what really happened? And that's when I decided, well, I'll go ahead and do this as a novel. It gives me a little protection because if they kill me, you know that everything I've exposed in these books are true. And so that makes me a martyr, and they probably don't want to do that. That might be one reason I'm alive, actually. So what I found was that there were so many things going on that day that are so beyond anything we were told. Now, keep in mind, I was just like everyone else. I watched it unfold on television. So I got the media's presentation of it. A lot of it didn't make sense to me, but there was much more stuff. There was a gold heist going on, and I think a lot of people don't know that. I sure didn't till I dove into this, that there was gold and precious metals held in the underneath a couple of the buildings in the World Trade Center towers, and there were a couple trucks that broke down before the buildings collapsed, even full of gold. The gold was insured. They claimed they got 100% of it, but really they got 10% of it, and the rest of it was covered by insurance. There was some things on the burner called the Enron investigation. There was also one into WorldCom and Global Crossing. And all of the evidence for those trials, which were coming up October 2001, were in Building 7. And Building 7, you'll remember, there was an announcer, Jane Stanley, from the BBC, who told us 20 minutes before the Solomon Building, also known as Building 7, had collapsed and the building is standing right behind her, which means there was someone in the BBC studios that told them that it was going to. Now, how would someone in London know that? Well, I found out an interesting connection. Ehud Barak, who had been the Prime Minister of Israel, was sitting in the BBC studios. So he might have had something to do with telling the person who puts her information in her teleprompter that the Solomon Building was going to come down. You'll remember the owner of that building, Larry Silverstein, he said, well, there'd been such a loss of life. I just told the fire chief, just pull it. Well, firefighters don't pull buildings. Demolition crews do. And so when you saw that, and people still, when they look at that, they see only a controlled demolition. So that means it had to have been wired well in advance. Ehud Barak seemed to know about it, sitting there in the studios in London. So there were these numerous things. So I wanted to create a way to really unfold all of that so that people could see how badly we'd been hoodwinked as a nation, and really the people of the world. There were, I think, people from 60 different countries that were killed in the towers and the planes that day. It wasn't just America that was under attack, and it wasn't just America that it was affected. So what I did was I created a guy, I called him the Truther's Truther. His name was Max Hager. And Max is such a lovable Vietnam vet, older gentleman, and he'd been working with a bunch of researchers. And he exposes all of this information that I found, and he's such a loving character that it's just like it reminds me of a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down, and that's so. what I've done with Max Hager. And so he delivers a lot of the truth. And what happened to me, Bill, is that being a flight attendant for 30 years and knowing the training, when I started to investigate what happened from the phone calls on the planes, I saw things that were such red flags that indicated to me that the flight attendants from Flight 11 wanted me to hear these things. And to your ears and to other people's ears that hadn't ever flown as a flight attendant, probably you wouldn't even have heard this. But Betty Ong called a reservations line. One, that is an insane thing for any flight attendant to do, to make a phone call, number one, and to call reservations, number two, because just like everyone else, she would have been on hold for 10, 15, 20 minutes. And if she was really in a hijacking, she might only have 30 seconds to get our word out, because the last thing you want to do is be caught on a telephone of any kind by a real hijacker. So I started to see a scenario unfold by what these flight attendants were saying. But she said to the reservations agent, he, as in one hijacker, this is Flight 11, Boston to LA, he sprayed pepper spray or mace in business class, and we can't breathe in business class. And I thought to myself, wait a minute. I thought of all the cheap perfume from Hawaii, from the souvenir stand, some broken bottles of rum coming out of Puerto Rico, and duty-free things that had opened out bottles of alcohol. And I thought, no, if someone sprayed something as harmful as pepper spray or mace, both of them were not legal to have on board the aircraft, in a pressurized cabin, it wouldn't just be in business class, it would be in the entire system, including the hijackers would be gassed themselves because they're breathing that same recirculated air. And the pilots, whoever they were, and the flight attendants. And yet these two flight attendants were on the phone for 27 minutes. Neither one of them ever complained about their eyes watering. And they never coughed. They never complained they had a hard time breathing or the effects of pepper spray or mace. They just said those words. And then one of the flight attendants, Amy Sweeney, she did something that no flight attendant would do. When she called in, she said the hijacker, again, one man as a he, was in 9B, and she gave him a seat number. The passenger who actually was in 9B was a highly trained assassin from a special operations unit from the Israeli Defense Forces called Sayeret Matkal. He was also trained as a hostage rescue specialist, which means he knew how the PA system worked, all of the emergency equipment on that Boeing worked, how to get into the cockpit, how sturdy the lock might be to get into the cockpit. He knew everything about a Boeing flight attendant would know. He was part of what's called a hostage rescue team, and that's who we would have worked with in a real hijacking. We tried to get the aircraft to the ground, and then we coordinate through the pilots to someone on the ground with a SWAT team of some sort, Navy SEALs or the Army Rangers or some type of force like that would come on board the aircraft through one certain door, and they would let us know at 5 o'clock on the dot, we are coming in the back door on the left side. So at that point, we want all the flight attendants on the floor so we don't shoot you, that kind of stuff. I did a little research into him because, one, you just can't kill a highly trained assassin who his friends and fellow soldiers claimed could kill any human being with a pen and a credit card with a plastic box cutter. Now, the plastic box cutters that they show as evidence for the Moussaoui trial, and they might have put these in the 9/11 commission hearings too, are the really thin, half-inch long, half-inch wide, bright yellow plastic handles with a tiny little razor blade that comes up, and it would be impossible to kill somebody with one of those, especially someone who was a trained assassin. So, and anybody that was taller than 5'6", because the hijackers were all little guys. So I found that was really odd because the official story leads us to believe that that poor Israeli guy was killed by the plastic box cutter, by the 5'6" guys. Well, so then I got to looking into him. He was supposedly, she called back, by the way, and said, oh, I made a mistake. The hijacker was really in 10B. Well, 10B, okay, and the hijackers are sitting behind him planning the new Pearl Harbor and the Project for a New American Century had called for, so that American people would rally in support of these 7 wars in the Middle East that they'd planned years prior to 9/11. That was another discovery I'd made. And this guy in 9B, he was fluent in English. He grew up in Denver, Colorado. He was fluent in Hebrew because he moved to Israel when he was 14, and he was fluent in Arabic. So if we have Arabic-speaking hijackers, 5'6" and 5'7", sitting behind him planning the new Pearl Harbor in Arabic, he would have heard every word they said. Because think about the last time you flew and how much of the persons behind you could hear their conversation, because they're not very far from your ear and they're speaking facing to you, because that's the way it works on the airplane. Now, just think about all those conversations you've overheard while you've been a passenger. So it doesn't make any sense that this guy could have been killed to me. And let me tell you this, a flight attendant would never, ever make the mistake of tagging the wrong passenger as a hijacker. Because if the next thing that happened was the pilot started landing the aircraft and the liberation force was coming in, they could easily kill the wrong guy. It's not a mistake we would make. We're much smarter than that, and we're much more careful. And you wouldn't have any hope that a second phone call even would make it through. So the whole thing was just so crazy that I started to see that. And then I went back to Betty Ong and she said something else that got my attention, and it wouldn't get somebody's attention that they didn't know. She said he stood upstairs. Again, about the hijacker, one single man, he. And that indicated to me that, one, since the pepper spray or mace wasn't affecting her, that they were no longer pressurized at altitude, at any altitude. And two, I knew that over the years I'd been through so many large hangars for airplanes that there are stairs up to the mezzanine office level of every hangar, including military hangars. And when she said the next thing, I realized what had happened. She said, we can't communicate with pilots. They're not answering their phone. They won't answer their phone. We can't communicate with the pilots. I remembered in the early 90s that Boeing tried to sell, and they did actually, to some airlines, not the one I was with, but to United and American. They had a thing called a flight termination system. It was a remote control device. And it's a plug-in device and plugs into the Boeing onboard computer system. And they sold it, listen carefully to the words they used, in the event of a hijacking and a hijacker would get into the cockpit, we could land the aircraft remotely, wherein it would be liberated by some Delta Force or some SWAT team. And my question was, in a conversation with some of the pilots over this, who's we? Who is the we that could land it remotely? Our plane. The reason the pilots didn't want this thing is it stopped all communication, just like Betty Ong told us she couldn't communicate with the cockpit. They couldn't even talk to the flight attendants in the cabin. Now, we are their eyes and ears, so unless we tell them there's a hijacker in the cabin, they wouldn't know it. Or if the plane's on fire or somebody's sick, or they wouldn't know anything that's going on because there's a cockpit door and they're facing forward. So unless they come out of there for some reason, they don't know what's going on in the cabin unless we tell them. And so that's why that communication is so important, especially in a hijacking, because we are their eyes and ears, and we would coordinate that landing with the Delta Force that was going to liberate the plane and passengers and crew, which door they were going to come in, what they were going to do when they came in, where the hijacker was, and we would be communicating all that using code words and information to the cockpit. And losing that, by putting that remote control system on board, you would lose all communication. So we wouldn't know if the Liberation Force was coming in the front door, the back door, the left side, the right side, or what they were going to do when they came in, and they wouldn't know where the hijacker was. So losing that communication is very, very difficult. But then it was the El Kabong right on my head. I realized the flight termination system had taken over. And when that happens, by the way, it operates on the same frequency that the air traffic control transponder for the aircraft. That transponder emits a little dot on their radar. It tells them it's American Flight 11, it's a 767, tells them their speed they're going and their altitude they're at. That's how we avoid hitting each other up there. So the air traffic control have that information. That's shot off through the transponder. But when the flight termination system takes over the airplane and now starts flying it remotely, the transponder, it uses the same frequency, so the transponder no longer works. So the pilots couldn't talk to other planes, air traffic control, or the flight attendants in the back. What they were experiencing on 9/11 is that aircraft were taken over remotely roughly 10 minutes after takeoff, certainly out of Boston, and landed. And what I did was I discovered that the first two planes came out of Boston, that they had to have had a runway of at least 10,000 feet because they were heavy with fuel and light with passengers, but heavy with fuel. So they needed a pretty good sized runway. And they phone call started roughly 20 minutes after Boston. So I knew they had to be relatively close. I took a map and a circle on Google Earth, and I found a Air Force base that all four planes were taken to remotely. And that all coincides with the time that the phone calls started. And literally, when I discovered that, Bill, I got sick to my stomach. I just backed away from my computer, and I couldn't even believe what I just discovered. And I told my husband, I said, the flight attendants are saying something here. Only my ears are hearing, obviously, because this information had been out. I was reading it off an FBI transcript that had been put in the 9/11 Commission and the Zachariah Moussaoui trial that was, a few years later. And I just couldn't even believe what I saw. For about a month, kept going back to that computer. And I teach the reader how to do this. It's a website where you can actually go into a flight calculator and pull down heavy jet and put in A to B. And I've given them the airport codes and everything. And it's pretty much exactly when the phone calls start from each aircraft, as once they got on the ground. Now, that Air Force Base was a reserve Air Force Base. And after Methodical Illusion came out, I was contacted by someone that was based there as a reservist. It was a C-5 Transport Air Force Base. They were not active, and they were activated that morning, their unit, after the second plane hit the second tower, or what we thought was a plane. And when they reported to the base, they found out that the base had been evacuated and that they were all locked out and they were housed in nearby hotels. And she said, I never could understand why that was, because when we get active, we go and we have a place there and we're on the base, and they wouldn't let us on. Well, why would you activate people and then not let them come to work? So she said, after I heard one of your interviews, I realized you were talking about my base, and that's why. There are about 6 aircraft hangars on that base that are large enough for a C-5 transport aircraft, and that's bigger than a 747, which is much bigger than the 757s and the 767s that were supposedly used that day on 9/11. So I got reconfirmation of that from her. And then while I was just finishing up the methodical deception, I got reconfirmation from a civilian that actually saw United Flight 175 west of the Air Force Base as it was circling around to land. And it was so close to the ground that she could see people in the window.
That's really super scary, isn't it? It really is like a scene out of a movie when you get that kind of visual. Are you able to say where that base is? I know that when the book first came out, your first book, you didn't really want to reveal that. Now it's in the public domain. I wonder if that's a piece of the jigsaw puzzle you would be willing to share at this stage.
Yeah, sure, I can. The reason when the first book came out, the reason I didn't say where it was I really wanted people to read The Methodical Illusion for all of the information, not just this one piece. This is just one tiny piece, but all of the information, how the flight attendants handle crashes, how incidences in the airline industry affect them, how they check in for flights, what they do on their layovers to go out to eat, and how all of that works, and then all of the 9/11 stuff. But yes, it was Westover Air Force Base, which is just outside of Chicopee, Massachusetts, 79 miles west of Boston, Massachusetts.
And it's like that's where the logic leads. That's where the rabbit hole took you. And it only took you to that one place. There was only one possibility, as I understand it. There was only one solution to all of this that fitted all of the unanswered questions.
Well, my key factor was the cell phone calls. They could not be made from the air. Even 4 years ago, I took a flight and I tried my cell phone the whole time. About 1,800 feet, it's maxed out. You can't get any cell reception at all. Nowadays, they have a few aircraft that are equipped with some satellite technology that you can. But in 2001, I mean, you could barely use a cell phone inside the Faraday cage that an aluminum airplane is. And so even sitting on the ground, You rarely got any reception. So it was those cell phone calls, and you'll remember that Barbara Olson, she called her husband, who was the Solicitor General at the Department of Justice at the time. She called in from Flight 77, and according to the official government documents, and they were at an altitude much higher than 1,800 feet. So I thought, well, gee, that's really odd that he would say. First, he said he first off he right away did a interview with CNN, and he lied. I have to say, he just lied. He said she tried to call collect from her cell phone. She called 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, and that story changes all the time. And then he said that she called from an airphone, the kind that the airplane had. And as of January 31st, 2001, American Airlines 757, which she supposedly was on, didn't have an activated airphone. So she had to have called from a cell, somebody's cell. She couldn't call collect from a cell. That's impossible. So not only does it look like he's a liar, but he's saying that she called from a cell phone. So I knew that's not true. It's not possible. But I did look into Barbara Olson. After the Methodical Illusion came out, I kept looking into all of these people, and that's part of the new book now is the things that I found. And so the word coincidence, I don't use it anymore. And I'll tell you why. Barbara Olson, she grew up in Texas. After a couple years of college, she went to Hollywood, and she went to work for Stacy Keach Productions at HBO. Now, if you know anything about Hollywood, HBO, I might as well say CIA. She worked there for a decade, and it's impossible to find what she did. She could have been acting. She could have been taking acting lessons. She could have been doing commercials. We don't know what she was doing while she was in Hollywood for a decade. She went to Yeshiva Law School. I believe it's in New York. It's a Jewish school. Graduated from there and went right into the top of the pick pile in Washington, D.C. She joined a law firm called Wilmer, Cutler, and Pickering. And one of the things I found really more than coincidence about Wilmer, Cutler, and Pickering is that Cutler, one of the founders of that law firm, was the White House counsel for President Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton. And another partner, C. Boyden Gray, he served as a White House counselor for the Vice President and then the President of the United States, George H.W. Bush Sr. Another interesting partner in the law firm that Barbara Olson worked at was Jamie Gorelick. She was a member of the 9/11 Commission. Now, one of the things I discovered is that the FBI really has been covering up everything about 9/11. But lo and behold, if the former FBI director, Robert Mueller, who was the director of the FBI at the time of 9/11, and I believe he started that job just a couple months prior, like in June. It may have been less time than that, but it's one of those people that just went into this key position. And he also was one of the lawyers in Wilmer, Cutler, and Pickering alongside of Barbara Olson in that whole thing. William Weld, who also was the governor at one time of Massachusetts, was in that law firm as well. So I'm seeing things that are way beyond coincidence, but then I look to see who some of their clients are at Wilmer, Cutler, and Pickering. Now, remember the guy I was telling you about, 9B, the guy who was the trained assassin? Well, he had a company called Akamai Technologies, and it's a communications company, internet and phone and stuff. And lo and behold, if the client list doesn't start out in alphabetical order with Akamai Technologies, the company that was owned by the passenger sitting on Flight 11 in 9B, the highly trained assassin and the Sayeret Matkal special operations agent from the Israeli Defense Forces, Daniel Lewin, his company is Akamai Technologies. The second company that's the client of Barbara Olson's law firm that she went to work for is another Israeli company called Amdocs. And if you don't have to look very deep to learn this, Amdocs is an Israeli company. They did phone directories, and they also helped some companies in the United States do billing. They were also monitoring every single phone call for a decade before 9/11. But they missed all the 19 hijackers calling each other. Now, there's another company that's also one of the clients. I found this really interesting. It's called Avid Technologies, and Avid Technologies specializes in video and audio production technologies. And one of the things that they specialize in is digital nonlinear editing, NLE. And it's very similar to cutting and pasting. And if you watch any NFL football games, you can see that the line of scrimmage that they show in a bright yellow or orange color, or the advertisements or the team's logos on the field, those are not visible if you're live in the stadium. That is live audio nonlinear editing.
So it's editing in real time.
That's correct. And I'm finding this really interesting because people keep asking me, how did they make that airplane look like it went through that building? And you remember seeing it, so like the wings sort of disappear right into the building. This is impossible because the wings are hollow, aluminum, and they have some fuel tanks in there, but they cannot slice through a steel building. A couple interesting companies that are clients for the same Barbara Olson law firm, Boeing, Citigroup, Credit Suisse, Deutsche Bank, they were kind of right there, HSBC Finance, which is also a CIA bank, UBS. And they also worked and represented, they did some investigative committees for the board of directors for Enron and for WorldCom. Remember, they were both in Building 7. And so this is just Barbara Olson's law firm connections to some of the things about 9/11. Now, okay, so one more step with Barbara Olson. She came out of law school. She married her husband, Ted Olson. Ted Olson was the attorney for the Israeli Mossad spy, Jonathan Pollard, who is still sitting right now in prison in the United States. So do we need any more connections to Barbara Olson and the Mossad?
It's fantastically incestuous, isn't it? It's like it all kind of loops around itself in this big tangle. I mean, it's the most extraordinary web.
It really is, and that's what I did with the methodical deception. I wanted to find out, Bill, where did people go that were in positions to stop this supposed attack? Where did they go after they were finished, after, let's say 2002 or 3 or 4, as they moved on in their careers? And the connections to people, and how was it that the Boston airport had no cameras at all in it? How could that possibly be? I flew out of that for a while. So I'm like, well, you just naturally assume when you do this professionally, you just naturally assume that and they have done all of the things that keep you and the passengers safe from this kind of stuff. Another interesting connection I looked into was the woman who was the head of the FAA at the time, the FAA administrator. And lo and behold, she'd been the director of Boston Logan International. And the director of Boston Logan International, that was the director at the time of 2001, had taken that job as a young 30-something. She'd been working for William Weld, also from Barbara Olson's law firm, who was the governor. She was his chief of staff and his campaign coordinator as a young lady. And they put her in position of director of, it's called Massport, or they carry all the transportation stuff out in Boston. And so she gets to work in the spring of 1999, and she discovers that none of the predecessors, directors in front of her, had ever put cameras in the passenger terminal. So she makes public that by the end of 1999, she guaranteed there would be working cameras in the airport terminal. But yet on September 11th, 2001, there was not one working camera inside Boston Logan. So we don't know who the terrorists were because there were 19 Arab hijackers on any of the real passenger manifests. That's only a claim made by the FBI. And so we don't know. We don't know who the passengers were. We don't know what they really looked like because there were no cameras. Well, I looked into her name was Virginia Buckingham. She coincidentally is married to a gentleman who's an attorney and a judge who spent his summers in Israel in kibbutzes. And his name is David Lowy, L-O-W-Y. You'll remember Larry Silverstein's partner in the World Trade Centers is Frank Lowy, L-O-W-Y. No connection that I know of, just a coincidence again. So I found this really interesting. And then every year for that airport to be functioning legally, she would have to take her security plan, which would show no cameras, in front of Jane Garvey, the head administrator of the FAA, and get approval to keep that airport operating, which she did in 1999, in 2000, and again in 2001. So I found that was very interesting that the FAA administrator would know this, and all of this planning is taking place. Most of the corporations involved in this were based in Massachusetts as well. And an interesting coincidence about Jane Garvey's husband, he just so happens to be the sheriff for one of the counties that surrounds nearly half of Westover Air Force Base. So if the eyewitness who contacted me after she read Methodical Illusion had called 911 and contacted him about this airplane that was way too close to the ground, that she could see people in the window and not where it should be, she could have been silenced or maybe just ignored. It's hard to say how they might have handled it. And it's also hard to say if other people did make that phone call, because this aircraft, I followed it. I have the flight plan in the Freedom of Information Act data. And I knew that it was on a southerly track. And when she contacted me and she told me where she was, and I got on a Google map and looked, and I knew exactly what time. And when she said exactly what time it was, and she knew that's because she was leaving on an appointment, that I knew that she was speaking the truth because I had followed that aircraft. And if we have time, I'd love to just read you this. I changed her name in the novel, but this is near the end of the Methodical Deception. This is her statement. This is a notarized affidavit that's legal in a court of law, and she's willing to go to court to share this word. My name is Sarah Swain. That's not really her name. And I was living in Otis, Massachusetts on September 11th, 2001. At approximately 8:30 to 8:35, I saw a United Airlines plane fly over my residence at the time, and I was shocked because the plane was so low. I could see the people in the windows. And I was standing on a deck on the second floor, and I was watching the plane fly over the top of the house, and I lost track of it because of the way the building was, but I do think it was going north when it flew over the house, and after I lost sight of it, I was speaking with my neighbor, and we were just amazed at the height of the plane. It was so low. I shouldn't say height, meaning altitude. It was just so low. We were flabbergasted. Now I know that it was approximately 8:30, and I would say 8:45 at the very latest, because I had to go to an appointment in the next town over and be there by 9:30, and I left maybe 5 minutes after the plane and headed over to Great Barrington, the next town over. Now, she lived with us for 14 years until she read Methodical Illusion, and she called me. She emailed me, said, "Please call me." And so I called her. She said, "You have vindicated my life. For the last 14 years, people had told me I was crazy," because she went to that appointment and she knew that she was going to come out and hear of this airplane crashing north of Otis, Massachusetts. And what she heard was that 2 planes hit the towers in New York, and 1 hit in Pennsylvania, and 1 hit in Washington, D.C. It didn't work with what she'd seen. So there is a signed affidavit of a person who was an eyewitness to what really happened on 9/11.
It's very chilling, isn't it? It's chilling and it's moving. And as you said, it just strikes you when you hear that. And at the same time, it makes you wonder who else hasn't yet spoken up, who saw things, who witnessed things, who knew things. And there's this huge web of accomplices in this at a senior level. I mean, there must have been thousands of people who were in on this whole thing, and it must have been elaborately planned for quite a long time, even though there were many holes in the execution of this. This was a very complicated thing that they tried to pull off here, and an awful lot of people must have been involved.
You know, I think in a project like this, I think people might have been involved but not know what they were involved in. Another interesting thing happened after Methodical Illusion came out. My publisher got a phone call from some people, and he and his wife had been somewhere on vacation, and they met a couple. He was a Navy man, and his wife had actually been in the Pentagon the morning of 9/11. He said, "Well, when my wife comes back, let her tell you her story. Here's her story." And it was an hour or 2, I'm not quite sure exactly, but at least an hour, if not 2, before anything hit in New York. She was at work at her office in the Pentagon, and her phone rang, and a voice she does not know to this day who it was said to her, "Get the hell out of the Pentagon and get out of there now," and hung up. She grabbed her purse and her belongings and got out of that building. And then the rest of the day unfolded. People knew in advance. And for some reason, whoever made that phone call to her didn't want her to be killed. She doesn't know who that was, but it does tell us that people knew in advance. Well, knowing that, it drove me to continue digging into who could have stopped it, the connections that they had with the companies, the state of Massachusetts, and the whole when I discovered that the head of the FAA's husband was the sheriff of the surrounding county, I couldn't even believe what I was reading. I was like, oh my God. Then if somebody saw something, there is a chance that they may have disappeared. It may not have been followed up on. There's a couple things that I kept finding, and a lot of people kept asking me, Bill, is why were the loads, passenger loads, so light those days on all 4 aircraft? Do you know if they'd been full, like most flights were, and often are still to this day, those planes each hold a roughly 200 people, a little more, a little less. So they would have had 800 bodies to take care of instead of the 260-ish. So there's something that kept driving me too, because all of our flights were full at that time. And that was one of the things I saw right at the beginning was, wow, those loads are just weird low, very strange, abnormally low. So that told me that somebody had access to the phone lines at the airlines, at United and American. They had to have. And in Methodical Illusion, I discovered this in an FBI document. There was a purser who was living in Miami. Most airline people know how this works. And we commute from coast to coast. I was commuting from the East Coast to the West Coast for many, many years. And so for us, we look at, so it's only 3 hours away. I mean, even if maybe it's on the other side of the planet, it's only 3 hours, 6 hours, 5 hours. So, we have people that commute from all around the world. And this lady was living in Miami, but flying out of Boston. And she was assigned on September 9th to fly Flight 11 on September 11th. And so she commuted up to Boston, got to a hotel, checked in, and the crew scheduling said to her, oh, we found a different purser to take that flight. And well, that's not possible. Once you're assigned a flight, nobody takes you off of it. If that flight's operating, it's yours and you get locked into it. So nobody can quite figure out how or why that happened. But what's really odd, and this is word for word from what I got from an FBI document, and no one ever talked about this elephant in the room either, because it indicates that their phone lines at American Airlines had been tapped. The airlines keep our phone number and our information very, very private. So to have this lady get home, she went back to Miami on the morning of 9/11. She probably took a 6 a.m. flight out of there, got into Miami, got home, and around noontime, on her home recorder was a message, and it was 2 gentlemen speaking perfect English, like the guy in 9B did. He grew up in Denver. Not saying it was him, just bringing that back to your attention. And a woman with a very heavy accent, and his wife actually does have a very heavy accent. And she could hear them say, if this had anything to do with Israel, there'll be backlash against the Jews. She called, of course, the FBI, and they came and confiscated her tape recorder, and we'll never, ever hear it after that, because that's what the FBI did with everything, including 85 cameras that were in view of whatever it was that hit the Pentagon. And those cameras were confiscated by the FBI within 30 minutes of whatever it was that hit the Pentagon. So that told me, because there's no way these handlers and the lady with the heavy accent could have known her home phone number without somebody tapping into the phone lines. And remember what I told you earlier. One of Barbara Olson's law firm's clients is Amdocs. They were tapping and recording all phone calls in the United States for a decade before 9/11. Another interesting thing I found is that Rockwell Collins, or Rockwell, had just updated the phone lines at American Airlines. So when Betty Ong called in on a reservations line, and she said that she was on a plane that was hijacked, she thought, she wasn't sure. She said, I don't know, we might be being hijacked, but somebody been stabbed. And so the reservation system has a big red button that's an emergency button that should have recorded every single word said until she hung up or the call was disconnected. That phone system had just recently been updated by Rockwell. And it was updated to the point where only 4 minutes of her phone call was recorded. And it had been that way ever since Rockwell did the update. And so we don't really know what all Betty Young really said, because we're just listening to now people who are claiming they heard, or they think they heard. They're not sure what she said. There is no tape recording. And so what I'm finding are these companies are all interconnected. You're right. So that's one of the things that I really expose in the methodical deception. So there's another company. I also found an FAA document from the FAA headquarters. They claim, even though we have nothing that says this from the flight attendants, the only two people talking from Flight 11, neither one of them said anything about anyone being shot. But FAA has a document that I have in the Freedom of Information Act data that claims at 8:44, 2 minutes before impact, that a passenger was shot. And you have to have a gun to do that. So if we just follow up with the official 9/11 story, we had bombs on board, we had a gun on board, we had box cutters and knives on board, and we had pepper spray and mace. All of those things were illegal to bring through security. So you want to ask yourself, well, who was running security? Well, lo and behold, if an Israeli company called Huntley USA, from their parent company ICTS, also out of Israel, the CEO of that company was put in prison as a convict in Israel for falsifying documents, among other things, some campaign finance problems too. And so I'm looking into this now. American and United had both hired Huntley USA from ICTS to do all their security. And they were also running security at Newark and Dulles and Boston at the terminals that day. So I guess you want to look at that to see, well, who are these people? Well, lo and behold, I look into that, and that's how I found out that the guy who started it, this Israeli company, was a convict in Israel, and the shady stuff behind this thing. And lo and behold, I always do this now. I look to see who's sitting on the board of directors. Now, you got a company, by the way, ICTS International runs security at Charles de Gaulle, and that's where the tennis shoe bomber Richard Reed got on board with the bombs in his tennis shoes. And then also they run Amsterdam Schiphol Airport, where the Abdul Muttalib, the panty bomber that just about took down a Northwest Airlines jet on Christmas Day, boarded the aircraft. A ICTS International runs their security. So they're failing all over the place, right? Who's sitting on their board of directors but during the time of 9/11, the Secretary of Transportation, Norman Mineta. Now, why would somebody want to associate themselves with such a loser, failing security company as ICTS International Huntley USA? But for some reason, Norman Mineta is sitting on their board. These are the things I kept looking at as I kept digging into this. And something else, if we have time. On Flight 93, you'll remember, that's the one, Let's Roll. They did a Hollywood movie right afterwards. At least three of the wives from these heroes had big book contracts right after 9/11 through large publishing houses in New York. So Let's Roll. Let's talk about Let's Roll. All four of the people that supposedly were involved in the Let's Roll take the cockpit back from the hijackers scene were sitting on phone calls in 4 different rows of seats, not talking to each other until less than 1 minute prior to the supposed Let's Roll event happened. Now, interestingly enough, all 4 of those gentlemen are 6'1" to 6'4", 220 plus pounds, and every one of them played rugby. One of them was even a judo champ and a rugby captain of his college team. They were all 30-ish. They were all, according to their friends, people who could basically kick ass and take names in any street fight. One of them, he was a gentleman that was still playing rugby in a team in California. He had just fought off a street mugger that was armed with a gun, a month or 2 before. And so all of his friends and coworkers said, well, he was just an incredible guy. He was huge. I mean, if you know anybody that plays rugby, they're just this side of hockey players. And by the way, Flight 11 had 2 professional hockey players on board.
And you don't mess with them either, right?
All of the hijackers were, 5'6", 7, 8. None of them were 6'1" or 2 or 4. So you have all these guys that were very aggressive, very athletic. And one of the things I remember, Bill, is right after I went back to flying, it took me about 2 weeks to get back to flying again after 9/11. But every man that came through the door said, if anybody gives you any shit, I'll kick ass. I'm in row 18J. I'm in here. Sometimes they would even write their number down and give it to me on a piece of paper so I wouldn't forget where they were. And I thought to myself, on 9/11, if you had a couple hockey players on board or 4 rugby players on board, would they sit on the phone and talk to a telephone operator in Todd Beamer's case because he didn't want to talk to his wife, or their wife or someone else on the ground? Or would they do something? And in normal life, yes, they would have done something. And so I realized that human nature didn't change if that were really the case. So I realized that this whole thing is just it's like a poorly written script. Hollywood B movie. Oh, imagine that, Hollywood. I said Hollywood. And it kind of goes back to Barbara Olson and Hollywood, doesn't it? Well, lo and behold, Hollywood. Let me just touch on this. There was a Hollywood producer sitting across the aisle from supposedly Mohammed Atta on Flight 11. And some interesting connections. But like I said, I no longer believe in coincidences.
Let me just do a provisional summary. What you feel that you have figured out beyond any reasonable doubt is that the phone calls were made on the ground in hangars at Westover Air Force Base, probably 20 minutes plus after the flights left. And there was some scripting involved. We haven't really talked about that in detail. That they were either told that this was a training exercise, or that they were under duress, or they were taken off the plane and given cue cards, or something. And the flight crew who were making these calls, at least some of them were trying to drop clues that weren't picked up for a long time, but you managed to do that. Now, could you flesh out that skeleton just a little bit more so you've got a really clear picture of what you think happened on the planes?
Well, the aircraft were taken over by the flight termination system remotely, or the pilots would have squawked their 7,500, which is a frequency, and if their transponder hadn't been taken over, they would have been able to do that the minute somebody came into the cockpit, or they knew there was something going on, or somebody was stabbed in the back. So since the pilots didn't follow their protocols, and the flight attendants didn't, Betty Ong even said, one of the last things she said was, I don't know, but we might be being hijacked. In a hijacking, you know it, and every crew member knows it, and we had specific step-by-step steps to follow in a hijacking procedure. And none of them did that. And those 2 flight attendants from Flight 11, that's where I just kept going back to on listening to every single word they said, because like I said, to my ears, I heard something. And I even said to my husband, she said this because she knew that I would know, a flight attendant would know, that there's no stairs in a 767. Why would she say that? Now, to a handler or the FBI or anyone else, that might not have said anything, but to me it did. It said she was in a hangar. I believe that the first 3 aircraft to come into those hangars, 2 people were taken off. The first 2 were flight attendants, the second 2 were passengers, and the third plane was a passenger and a flight attendant. Another thing that happened, Amy Sweeney and Betty Ong from Flight 11, the 2 flight attendants, Betty Ong said at least a half a dozen times or more that she was seated in her jump seat at 3R, that's just the right-hand side of the aircraft in the very back. But Amy Sweeney said that she was sitting in the second to the last row of seats in coach in a passenger seat, and she said that Betty was sitting right next to her. And then Betty said that they'd called was a passenger had been stabbed. That was supposedly 9B, the Akamai Technologies CEO. And that they had called for medical, but nobody was responding. And Amy Sweeney said there was a doctor and a nurse taking care of him. So they're saying 2 different conflicting stories. And one of the things the FAA stressed to us is that if you're getting information to the cockpit, that's how we would normally get information, through an interphone, that it all needs to be the same exact information. So if you don't know, don't say it. reconfirm it with the person who does know, and make sure that it's all the same information. And those girls were saying things that were just direct opposites, even where they were sitting. Like I said, if a Delta force came in and Betty's sitting there at 3 on the right-hand side in the aft in her jump seat, our jump seats fold down off a wall. And so if you're sitting there and they open a door and come charging in, you could have your kneecaps broken. And that's not what you want to do in the middle of a hijack evacuation. And so knowing where she was vitally important. And that's the kind of data that we need to have everybody on the right track, on the same track, and giving the same information. So again, I saw another red flag with the flight attendants that made me realize that this was not a normal hijacking procedure, and that more than likely those two women were in two different offices upstairs in the hangar. And if you've ever been in a large airplane hangar, there's a mezzanine level that's full of office space, and that was the only thing that made sense to me. Now, another thing that I did was I followed the next flight out of Boston, United 175, and only 2 passengers called in from there. And one of them was supposedly a pilot, military pilot, who's now working as a consultant. I couldn't really find too much about him, but I did find some interesting data in his obituaries. He was an employee for MITRE Company, M-I-T-R-E. MITRE Company is kind of like a shadow government company. They started out in the early 1950s, coming out of MIT. And they have been working with radar, with NORAD and our Strategic Air Command, our air safety program for the military, and NORAD, and also with the FAA and their radar. Yet on 9/11, some 50 years later, the FAA and NORAD radars are completely different. And on 9/11, there was a fighter jet that eventually scrambled around 9:24 over New York City. Now, the plane they were scrambled for, Flight 11, had supposedly crashed into the tower at 8:46. So almost 45 minutes later, he actually sees on his radar screen on board his jet, Flight 11 heading southbound to Washington, D.C. You got to ask yourself, how did that happen? Because, wait a minute, that plane had crashed into the North Tower. But there was 2 companies in the FAA headquarters, PTAC and MITRE, coincidentally. There's another coincidence for us, that were working on these ongoing war games that were taking place that day. So they were able to make bogeys or targets appear and disappear that weren't really there for the military. And so the commercial planes could easily have been disappeared on radar as well, because that's what they were doing in the FAA headquarters that day. Now, so I've looked into the other guy who calls, and this was just some crazy information. Peter Hansen, he was traveling with his wife and 3-year-old, going to Disneyland, just to touch your heart a little bit. Peter Hansen calls his dad, and he tells his dad at 3 minutes before impact, by the way, now this airplane, where they claim it was, I'll tell you, was almost directly over the Hudson River. The Statue of Liberty on the left side of the aircraft where the pilot was sitting was Newark Airport, and they were about 7,000 feet high. So you could see the Statue of Liberty pretty good from there. And, of course, the Manhattan skyline. And so he tells his dad that he thinks that terrorist hijackers are going to fly them into Chicago and fly them into a building. Now, how would he know that? Because the hijackers didn't speak understandable English. None of them did, according to the official government story, who they were. And he was sitting at row 31 on the right-hand side of the aircraft with his wife and daughter. You don't really think that a hijacker is going to go back and tell this one guy traveling with his wife and daughter of their plans to go to Chicago and fly into a building, now do you?
It's almost like they shuffled the cue cards and got some of them in the wrong people's hands,
There's a possibility that these 2 gentlemen, both of them worked for companies that were MITRE is basically the shadow government. And this is how small the world is now, Bill. I had an email come to me from a pilot's pilot. And he was from one of those fighter jets where there's a pilot in the front and this guy in the back. And he was what's called an RIO. He was a radar intercept officer. So he's a radar specialist. And he was sitting on the left side of the aircraft looking over a Newark International Airport, and it's huge, and Newark Bay. And he told his mother, 3 minutes before impact, supposedly, that he thought he was over Ohio. Now, it's impossible to be looking at Newark International, the Hudson River, and the Newark Bay at a 7,000-foot elevation as a pilot and think you're in Ohio. It's impossible. So he might not even have been on the plane. Because according to what they claim where the location of the plane was, it's just like the guy, Peter Hansen, who told his dad this. But the first time Peter Hansen called his dad, it was at 8:52, and he told his father, this would have been right about the time the plane had been landed, he told his father this, and this is terminology that Americans don't use. The airline hostess had been stabbed. And I'm like, wait a minute. We've never been called airline hostesses in the United States. That's a foreign term used in Europe. It's used in the Middle East. El Al from Israel happens to use that term. And lo and behold, here's another coincidence for you. Hang on to your hat and fasten your seatbelt. Michael Chertoff's mother was the first airline hostess for El Al. She was also a Mossad agent for El Al Airlines. She was an airline hostess. So somebody like him would use that word, but it's not. This is not an American that's writing the script, okay?
Oh boy, yeah. I mean, clearly various people who made the phone calls were in a hangar, and they didn't all fully know what they were meant to be saying or where they were meant to be or what was meant to happen. But they kind of did their best under some circumstances that we can imagine. They muddled through. And you've even discovered that one of the callers, and I would like you to tell the audience about this, you can just make out that at the very end of the call, before they hung up, somebody said you did a good job.
Right. That's a flight attendant from Flight 93, Cece Lyles. And again, this is Flight 93, where all those heroes, supposedly, were 6'1" to 6'4", 220 plus pounds, sports figures, very aggressive, athletic types. But Cece Lyles, she was a police officer for 6 years before she started to be a flight attendant. She'd been flying for about a year. She called her husband, and she left a very, very sad goodbye message to her husband on their home recorder. Again, this is something a flight attendant would do under duress. She did not hang up the phone. She handed the receiver to someone, it sounds like a woman, and according to most voice specialists that have heard this, the woman's voice says to her, "You did great." And no one would be telling a flight attendant that. Now keep in mind, at the time, according to the government documents, that airplane she was on and the woman sitting next to her saying, "You did great," was coming out of the sky 6,000 to 10,000 feet per minute at a 40-plus degree angle, and quite possibly upside down, because when those four heroes went charging through the cockpit to take it over, the aircraft was upside down, according to the National Transportation Safety Board. Now, I was good in the aisle, but I don't think I was that good that I could take a beverage cart or meal cart and a 757. The aisle's only about 25 inches wide. This is the aircraft. If there's a cart in the aisle, you can't get by unless you stand inside a row of seats. And if the plane's full, it's impossible to do that. And so it's not everybody's favorite airplane, but that's a very, very narrow aisle. I worked it many, many times. I know it very, very well. So the whole idea of them even coming out of the sky 6,000 to 10,000 feet with a beverage cart or a meal cart in the aisle is insane, impossible. But then when you figure a 40-degree angle and or upside down, according to what the government claimed the plane was doing, because it had to be upside down to go in and make just a divot and completely disappear into the dirt, as they claim it did in Shanksville, right?
Yes, sure. So really, it was audio theatre. I mean, it's interesting that earlier on you talked about Orson Welles and the War of the Worlds. It's like we heard this staged audio presentation designed to give us a certain picture about what had happened. And it was only Barbara Olson who talked about the box cutters. Nobody else did at all. And that they were all of Middle Eastern descent. Otherwise, as I think you said once, we wouldn't have been taught who to hate and who to go to war with and which military action to support and all this kind of stuff. It was all staged almost in a very amateurish way, and they kind of got away with it. They just got away with it. But all of this was happening in the hangar, and none of this happened, right?
Well, that's correct. I don't know. People ask me this all the time. I don't know what it was that hit the Pentagon. I just know it wasn't a Boeing 757. I don't know what hit in Shanksville to make that divot. Some people claim that divot was there on Google Earth years before 9/11. I don't know. I didn't look. But I know there was no airplane crash there. I couldn't see anything that hit the North Tower. And the Naudet brothers were the only ones. They were actually doing a documentary on New York firefighters that day. they happened to just take their camera and look up and see when you slow that film down, a 767 cannot fly that fast. Whatever it was that hit the North Tower is actually spiraling. You can see it, and I've got a YouTube out for announcing the methodical deception on my YouTube channel, and it goes into a little slideshow, and that's one of the slides, and you can actually see it's been slowed down enough to you can actually see a spiral, much like we saw in the sky over Norway, just a spiral. And an aircraft does not do that. It leaves a vortex under the wings and the jets, but you will not spiral like that. And it's one thing. And the first responders and the police and the fire department and dispatch, they all heard callers call in and claim that a missile had been launched from the Woolworth building in lower Manhattan. Not a plane hit the tower, the North Tower. Now, there's firefighters that were in a fireboat on the river that called into dispatch. This is all, you can find this on YouTube too. They say that the second plane to come in was a military aircraft, not a commercial plane, that it was dark gray or green, but it was a bomber style aircraft. And that's coming from two firefighters that were on the river that the thing flew over. And they called into dispatch and said that's what that was.
And it had this big pod on the underneath. You can see that very clearly on some of the videos, can't you?
That's correct, yeah. That's another thing that it's just not there on a commercial jet. So, one of the cool things about methodical illusion that's happened to me is it's connected me with a whole bunch of professional airline people and United and American pilots alike. And that's their question is how did they make that plane look like it flew through a steel building like a hot knife through butter? So it's interesting that I find with Barbara Olson all the connections. I mean, what are the chances that the guy who was in Flight 11 in 9B, who was a flight attendant, said was the hijacker, that he would be a client of her law firm that she went to work for, who also, the partners worked for George Bush. So interesting, and if we have enough time, I just want to take you to one interesting connection that I found for methodical deception, and that's with the art students.
Please share that story about the art students. It's a wonderful story. Just another unbelievable component of this complicated mechanism that really started rolling months before the day itself. But there are so many components of this, and this is yet another one.
Yeah, this is just amazing. For methodical deception, I used all U.S. government documents. So what I did was I split myself into three fictional characters. And so you'll see that one person will come in with some information, another one will come with that. This is all stuff I found while I was continuing to dig into this 9/11 event. And it was very methodically planned out, quite a ways in advance, and it was an illusion and it was a major deception, both of them. One of the things I found was a 61-page DEA document. It was a DEA report that told the story of Israeli art students that were actually discovered all around the United States. Now, these people were found all over in several cities in Florida, in Texas, including the home of American Airlines in Fort Worth, Texas, Chicago, Illinois, where United is based, all over the country. And they were going door to door to government offices like for IRS and DEA offices, some federal air marshals even. I mean, they were just showing up. And they were also showing up at these guys' homes and trying to sell artwork that they'd bought in China for $8 and for $100 or $150. And they would introduce themselves as Israeli art students. Well, lo and behold, they showed up at enough places that were not public knowledge. So like, there's a private fusion center. It's not in the phone book, right? So then the government agents started looking, and the DEA at the time was also following some Israelis because there was an ecstasy drug ring going on. So they were kind of keeping an eye on these guys anyway because they knew they were running these drugs. But so we got these art students that they start showing up, and this DEA official who sends out like an APB and says, heads up on these guys. So then the federal employees start IDing them and asking them for their identification and what they're doing. They would go into these federal buildings and ask for blueprints or have blueprints in their hands of these buildings, ask about security, did they have cameras, and just really oddball questions, enough that they got flagged by these agents, federal agents. And so they started IDing him, and lo and behold, they come out. They're Israeli Defense Forces. Some of them were bomb experts, and some of them had ID to identify them as Israeli Mossad, and that is like the CIA. That's a kind of a intelligence operations. Like the guy on 9B, he was a Sayeret Matkal, and that's a special highly trained. I call it like it's like the Israeli Jack Bauer. I mean, these guys are trained assassins. They are trained to kill people, and also trained in hostage rescue. Benjamin Netanyahu and Ehud Barak are also members of the Sayeret Matkal. And so, if you'll go to my website, I'm going to just walk your listeners through this. You can go through the methodicaldeception.com, and you'll hit on in the navigation bar. It says resources. And once you click on that, it'll take you to a page, and at the top left of that page is a white box, and it'll say something to the effect for the Israeli art students at the World Trade Center, WTC. Click here. Click on that here, and it's going to take you to a back page where you'll see some photographs. And these are the photographs that I want to bring to your attention because this is what just absolutely blew me away. Some of the art students that were traveling around the country, and this is in the year 2000 and 2001, most of them were picked up and deported. There was over 100 of them, around 140, 160. They were considered to be an Israeli spy ring, and some of the bomb experts that some of them were that were traveling around Texas and Florida actually ended up in New York. Now, this is what happened in the spring of 2000. There was a group of foreign art students called themselves Gelatin, and they came over to New York to do an art project. Now, just imagine what this art project is. You'll see a picture of this as you scroll down. They named their group Gelatin, and gelatin is often a kind of a slang in the demolition business for gelignite or blasting gelatin, often referred to as jelly. And they called their art project the B thing, B as in boy. And you'll see the title page on that page of pictures on the left-hand side of their book. And what they did for their art project is they built a wooden balcony. They were actually living on the 91st floor. And with the Lower Manhattan Cultural Center, who is also on the 91st floor, there were no offices up there, just these guys were living there. The identification you'll see on the right-hand side, the middle of that page of pictures, that's a paper temporary construction pass, easy to reproduce for 2001, that they all had. So they had the run of the entire World Trade Center complex with those temporary construction passes. Now, I just want to bring your attention to this. In the pictures, you'll see on the right-hand side, the smaller square picture of a gentleman who's kind of wearing a pink top, like a shirt. And he's got some repelling gear on him because they removed a window at the 91st floor and lowered out this wooden balcony and took pictures. And their sponsor, who sponsored them to come to New York to do this project, this art project, had rented the Millennium Hotel top floor and a helicopter and took the pictures that they used in their book called The Bee Thing that's now out of print. If you look at the guy in the pink shirt and all of the pictures, just look at all three of those pictures of those Israeli Mossad art students that are in the 91st floor of the World Trade Center. The cardboard boxes behind them are marked, and you can see this clearly with two bold letters that say BB18. Those designate a fuse holder that can be used for remote control demolition from a company called Lytel Fuse in Chicago, Illinois. I started to look into this Lytel Fuse company because what kind of artist would use hundreds, if not thousands, of fuses? All three of those pictures show you BB18 boxes that have been taped together that are no longer carrying the fuse holders that can be used for remote control demolition. So I looked into this Lytel Fuse company that represents that BB18, and I find out that they are part of a company from Austin, Texas called Tracor Incorporated. They went bankrupt in 1991, and they split into three independent companies: Tracor Aviation, as in airplanes, which wasn't bankrupt; Lytel Fuse Company, which is the company that is represented by those cardboard boxes behind the Israeli Mossad art students, and Tracor Defense Holding. Now, Tracor was the largest North American defense electronics contractor at the time. They were later on acquired by Marconi Electric Systems, MES it's referred to, and they are a subsidiary of GE Company in 1998. British Aerospace purchased Marconi Electric in 1999, and they formed what's called BAE Systems. So I'm sure all of this is familiar to most everybody that's looked into this. Now, Tracor became the BAE Systems, and then it became called something else. And this is another thing I found. It became Electronics Integrated Solutions. Now, another interesting character, Bobby Ray Inman, who was the head of Naval Intelligence, who was the head of National Security, the NSA, and he was also at the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency. He was the chairman of a company that bought Tracor called Westmark Systems. Just another interesting coincidence. But this Tracor company, a little birdie told me to look into this. Now, this is really fascinating stuff here. Tracor, who owns Lytel Fuse, who belongs to those boxes behind the art students, has an interesting history. In 1950, they bought a company called Vitro, V-I-T-R-O. Now, Vitro is a huge subcontract for the Defense Department. As a matter of fact, I found an article in 1996 where the Vitro company of Rockville had announced that they were working with the Department of Defense, and they were doing a $3 billion project with the Department of Defense in a software engineering deal with defense companies, and that's all wrapped around some missile guidance system. And just like a lot of people think that a missile hit the North Tower now, don't they? So an interesting thing about this Vitro company, they had bought another company called Kellex. And so as I'm digging down, peeling the layers of onion here, Kellex Company was created in 1942 by M.W. Kellogg Company. And now you remember Kellogg's from the cereal, right? Everybody that grew up knows this. Well, this company was created, Kellex, in 1942, and it was relating to the Manhattan Project. And so Kell standing for Kellogg, and the X stood for secret. The company's goal was to design a facility for the production of enriched uranium through a gaseous diffusion technique. And in gaseous diffusion, isotopes of uranium-235 could be separated from uranium-238 by turning uranium metal into uranium hexafluoride gas. Now, we know this company today as it transpired and later on became a company that a lot of people are more familiar with. Kellogg, remember this guy's name was Kellogg, he joined up with Brown and Root, and we now know them as KBR, and they're also a company that has either been the owner or the parent company or the subsidiary of another company a lot of people remember, and that is called Halliburton. And that was a company that Vice President Dick Cheney was the CEO of.
That's quite an interesting family tree, isn't it? Oh, boy.
And that's what happened when I looked at those cardboard boxes and I started to see, well, what were in those cardboard boxes? Here we have Israeli bomb experts with some foreign art students who had been busted by the DEA and other government agencies, and they were all, right after 9/11, swiftly put on an El Al jet and safely ferried back to Israel, where nothing can ever happen to them.
Now, this begs another question, and it's a sensitive one, but over and over again in this tangle that we're looking at, this interrelated tangle, we see Israel, Israeli connections, Israeli people, Mossad, Israeli influences. What is your best hypothesis, if you're willing to suggest one, about what the connectivity is? And if we're talking about Danny Casolaro's octopus, which you reference in your book, what is the head of this octopus, as best you might guess?
That's a great question. It's really a complicated one. You'll remember also I haven't even brought up the 5 dancing Israelis that were arrested in New Jersey. And they went back to Israel, and they were all Mossad agents. all 5 of them, and they went on Israeli television, and they said this. They said they were sent to document the event, which means they were sent from Israel to go to New York to document what someone in Israel knew was going to happen. Now, coincidentally, we have Ehud Barak sitting in the BBC studios that day. He was the gentleman who coined the phrase war on terror and was sure that within 12 hours we would know that it was Osama bin Laden who did this to us. So it does all go back, right back to them. And if you look at the history, I mean, listen, I have to tell you honestly, I got so deep into this 9/11 thing and what I was finding and who I was finding. I kind of went back into history to Babylon and came back through through the Zohar, the Talmud, and the John F. Kennedy assassination and several other false flag events, including the USS Liberty, which is who my new book is dedicated to, the crew of the USS Liberty, another false flag by Israel covered up by the United States. I don't know who the head of this snake is or what it is, but everything does point back to the Mossad. It's not an anti-Semite thing. It is their intelligence agency. There's a lot of corporations involved, and that's one of the things I wanted to follow up on. One of the things I found was the major cover-up was by lots of people inside the U.S. government. And now maybe the Mossad was part of the doing it, planning it, but the cover-up was done by a lot of dual citizens that were running the show. I'm just amazed every time I find these weird connections. Like Barbara Olson could not be more, oh, by the way, she's also Jewish, but she couldn't be more connected to Israel, the Mossad, and the Hollywood CIA connection. And then look at everyone that was in the law firm that she just instantly slid right into when she graduated from law school.
I assume you're suspecting, although you haven't said this, that Barbara Olson is probably still alive and was given a new identity.
That's quite possible. She may not have been on the plane, actually. There's a chance that she could have just not even gotten on the plane. We don't know who was on the plane because there are no cameras to show us. Even though they may have had cameras in the terminal, they haven't ever been released. So there's no picture proof that she was even on the aircraft.
So what you're saying there is it doesn't matter whether she made the call from Westover in a hangar or from somewhere else and was kind of spliced into the audio story somehow.
That's possible. Yeah, I mean, anything's possible at this point. I mean, she said that they were all herded to the back of the plane. This is one of the things that most of the callers said as well. And now, just so you know, she was on a 757. 757 is a single aisle, very narrow airplane, much like the old 707. And so if you have all of the passengers, like there were 56 of them on her flight, all of the passengers in the back tail section, that plane was not going to fly correctly. And then you'll remember that that's the airplane that came down in a 270-degree corkscrew turn into the exact spot of the Pentagon without its wings or its jets ever hitting the grass, and yet somehow managed to hit the first floor of the Pentagon. I mean, it's impossible. It's just impossible. The whole thing is just impossible. I don't know where she really was, the whole thing, but she's so damn connected to the military-industrial complex. I remember growing up as a kid hearing about Kennedy's assassination and hearing these words, military-industrial complex. Well, I found them, and I found all of the people that were in position to stop this, to prevent this from happening, are now sitting on the board of directors for companies that I list in the new book. All of them are Rockwell Collins, DynCorp, Boeing, Raytheon. Raytheon had 5 electronic warfare specialists on the flights. I mean, there were lots of people that could have been potential handlers on board. Just coincidentally, we had an Israeli woman on 175 who'd served in the IDF as well. What are the chances of that? I mean, you get to a point when you get into this kind of research, and there is no such thing as a coincidence. I'm sorry, I know that somebody has said that in the past, a politician or someone, but you cannot continue to keep chalking things up as, oh, that's just a coincidence, because there's just way too many of them. They're stacked up as high as those towers right now.
Oh boy, yeah, I mean, absolutely. Where I would like to go now with our conversation is really taking it off where your books go. Because, of course, once you're fictionalizing this story, there are a lot of people who conveniently know each other and a lot of things conveniently happen. And, of course, I understand this in terms of like a novel narrative of all of this. You sort of have to put it together that way. but there's unlikely to be quite such a neat deus ex machina happy ending in the real world. And I wonder if I could ask you personally, what do you think is likely to happen over the next few years to allow all this to unfold in the public perception, to cause there to be some kind of justice transpiring over this monumental conspiracy? What do you think is likely to happen? Because you don't have the support, as best you know, of people in high places. And so you're not really quite as set up as Vera was in the books. And I wonder if you could speak to that somehow from your own personal point of view.
If you'll remember in Methodical Illusion, they find a tape recorder pen that Grace had left behind in Paris, and they capture the voice of someone who's not an Arab. And he has a plan, and they discuss that plan. I actually found that plan. It just didn't have the 5 or 6 major cities listed. But this is what I think is going to happen. Just exactly what they said in that tape. And I read it in a Ynet News out of Israel. And here's what it said. Israeli Mossad had intercepted an al-Qaeda plan to attack 5 or 6 major cities in the United States using biological, chemical, and or nuclear warheads over a 9-day period. Now, this article that I read claimed they were going to do it in honor of the May 2nd death of Osama bin Laden. But everyone in the Middle East knows that Osama bin Laden actually died December 26th of 2001. So he wasn't really killed in that Navy SEAL Shazam that Obama's people put together. So, of course, it's nonsense to think that any Arab would mark that anniversary this way. However, one of the things I discovered is through the Promise software and through all of the Israeli companies that the United States government has hired and the software that has a backdoor installed in it, Israel is in control of our entire national security. And if they want that scenario to happen and they want to blame it on Iran, that false flag will happen. And I often refer to it as a nuclear 9/11. And I think that that's what they will do because people around the world are waking up to their involvement in 9/11. That's my take. I don't think, unless we can talk about it and shout it from the rooftops and wake everyone up to see who was really behind 9/11, and when we can stop them from doing their next planned false flag. And it is planned. I read it in print. I read the story out loud to my husband, and then it was quickly scrubbed off the internet. But I realized once they scrubbed it that that message was given to someone. That could have been given to Rahm Emanuel, the mayor of Chicago, for all I know, but it was given to the right people that knew that maybe it's with the Shemitah or maybe it was with some other thing that's lining up, but that is what probably will happen to the United States.
Is it your personal suspicion that this may be planned at this stage to happen sooner rather than later? Or do you think there may be time to play with here?
That's hard to say. You know, the Israelis have said that they would pull something that they call the Samson option. And basically, they have said that if things get dicey for them, they'll just nuke us. And that's the Samson option. You can look it up on Wikipedia. And retaliate with nuclear warheads. And now everyone smart enough to see that they really badly want us to go to war and they want us to nuke Iran. And they want to nuke the peace deal with Iran. And they're going crazy about it. We're very, very vulnerable as a nation because people just don't know how vulnerable we are because we have trusted our best friend in the Middle East for so many years. I mean, I remember when Pan Am 103 came out of the sky and I was in training, my yearly training, and I learned, this is before I discovered what I did looking into 9/11, I discovered that, and this was well-known information, and we got it in training from the FAA, Pan Am had hired an ex-Mossad agent to run their security in Frankfurt. Well, later on, I read this story called The Trail of the Octopus, and I realized that the Mossad and the DEA and the CIA were kind of in competition for running heroin out of the Middle East, and that's kind of what that whole Pan Am 103 thing was about. And if you'll remember, just like 9/11, the 5 dancing Israelis said, Palestinians are your problem. We're not. Okay? They always try to blame Palestine. Well, they did the same thing with Pan Am 103. They tried to blame Iran. And then they tried to blame Syria. And then, because those are their next two targets, and we're pulling Syria apart right now. You can see why all the refugees, because we're bombing them, and Israel is bombing them every day. And so they also tried to blame other things on Palestinians as well. So they always do that, and they do the same thing all the time. It's like the Charlie Hebdo Paris shooting. The shooter just coincidentally stole a car that belonged to the best friend of the editor of Charlie Hebdo, and it happened to be coincidentally parked in front of a Mossad frequented patisserie, a bakery. And so what are the chances of that happening? And so then, of course, the two shooters, they were killed, and they were both orphans, so nobody went to their funeral, and then it just got dropped. And they turned that whole thing into an anti-Semitic event. This is another false flag that they did, just like so many others. And if people don't wake up to realize that this stuff is all orchestrated. Last week I did a radio show with a survivor from the USS Liberty, and they know what happened. And I also was contacted by someone that told me that someone on their deathbed told them that the United States military was ordered to shoot the USS Liberty out of the water and sink it. And those pilots refused their orders. And so it was put in the hands of the Israeli pilots, or they would have sunk that ship. Again, all to drag us into the 1967 war with Egypt. So people do need to wake up and pull your head out of you, wherever it is, and really start to wake up to what's going on. And I like to tell people we are so vulnerable in the United States for another false flag attack, and I would say that it will be nuclear, and it will be blamed on Iran, that people need to be ready to take care of themselves and their family as much as possible.
Oh boy. Now you talk about people waking up. And I know, and you know, and everyone listening to this knows that more and more people are waking up every day. Are enough people waking up, or the right people waking up? And the second question is, you've had a lot of very gratifying feedback from your first book of people, not diehard conspiracy researchers like Max in the book, but Mr. and Mrs. American Everyman and Everywoman, who have been directly helped and stimulated by your book to realize some truths for themselves.
I did an interview with Coast to Coast AM, and literally thousands. My book shot to number 9 overall on Amazon out of 8.5 million books. And that means a lot of people were reading it. I think I autographed 2,500 books right after that show and sent out to people. And people contacted me not only as eyewitnesses reports and people that were based at the Westover Air Force Base and locked out, but a lot of people have come, and this is just like Joe and Mary, farmers in Ohio and all over the country, that just said to me, I always thought this was a lie, or I always knew there was no plane crash in Shanksville or at the Pentagon. I never saw that. And in conjunction with Brian Williams and Bill O'Reilly and some of those news people being caught or getting exposed, like Anderson Cooper on CNN as being working with the CIA. Most of them are CIA. And the control of the media and the fact that they've been caught lying to people just kind of corresponds with this. And the support has been absolutely incredible. I'm just totally speechless. I've had scientists try to come forward and tell me about some of the high-tech weaponry that was possibly used in the towers. They're trying to nudge me in the right direction. I'm actually digging in there now.
Is there anything there that you could share about that at this early stage?
No, other than I'm finding that there was technology available to do a lot of the things that we saw. I haven't quite got it enough to talk about it yet, but I went to bed last night reading it, and I woke up this morning reading it. It's actually, there's about 5 files sitting on my desktop right now in front of me, and I'm pulling it. It's all back to the same people. This is DARPA. This is the General Atomics Company, SAIC, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman. All of those companies are involved, and they're involved in some really nasty stuff.
And you might have the components there for a third book.
I have the domain and the title already picked out. I know, don't tell my husband. I mean, truly, I sleep with my laptop, and I read until I fall asleep. And it's funny because the other day I'm literally washing my hands, and the water's running, and I truly heard a voice that said, look into that Lytel Fuse Company. And so I did, and that's where I found Tracor. And it traced me back to KBR and to Kellex and to the uranium and all of that stuff. And I was like, wow. I called my husband. He was golfing. I said, you're not going to believe what I just found. He goes, I'll believe it. I'll believe it. Because of the stuff I have found that no one else did. I'm like, how come nobody's talking about this? He goes, I don't know. Maybe they just couldn't see it. Or I'm like, for me, I said, if the handlers and the planners and the perpetrators of 9/11 had just asked a flight attendant to be a consultant on this project, they wouldn't have got caught. If you haven't been an airline person, a flight attendant, you don't know the protocols, so you don't know what they would have done. Most people don't even know that cell phones don't work at altitude. I tried to debunk myself for so long and at this point now, as I dig in, now I'm seeing it's people in this country are just afraid to point to the elephant in the room. If it has anything to do with Israel, the Mossad, or anything to do with that, even the FBI, they'll run and hide. The DEA, the guy who filled that report, that 61-page report of these Israeli Mossad and Israeli Defense Force bomb experts traveling around pretending to be art students going through federal buildings. That guy was referred to as a disgruntled employee, and boy, would I like to talk to him. I'm very grateful that people that have been very, very supportive and brought information to me, whether they're scientists that knew the research and development and the technologies that were being worked on at the time and the things that were available, or military or air traffic controllers or pilots or flight attendants. A lot of the friends from the flight attendants that were killed have contacted me that knew Betty Ong and those flight attendants personally. I do know that they're all dead. I mean, the flight attendants weren't in on this. They were there, and they're really dead, and their kids have spent the last 14 years without their mom. I'm actually working on a third book right now, and in the meantime, I'm also gathering up some information on chemtrailing because I keep finding connections through my 9/11 research into aerosols and biotech companies involved in these same people. So I'm just a little birdie's telling me to follow the chemtrail trail. And so I'm kind of doing a couple things, and it's pilots and planes and sky and all of that stuff. But I keep finding a relationship. So as I'm digging into this next phase, looking into some of the weapons that are out there right now. I mean, we have aircraft right now with chemical lasers on that can shoot lasers, just like Star Wars, laser beams, and they make things disintegrate, like we saw the towers disintegrate. So there's lots of stuff going on.
There are a lot of weapons which are very sophisticated. I've been told myself by various insiders that the kind of technology they've got is at least 50 years ahead of the public domain. And that will probably not surprise you at all based on what you're finding out.
That's correct, yeah. For me, my mission was to find the planes of passengers and crew members, and I did that in Methodical Illusion. Now I'm digging into who did it and who let it happen and who benefits from it, and all of those people that were in positions of somewhat power, whether they were with the military or a government agency. And what happens is they get involved with this, and I really try to get into this without it being too complicated in the Methodical Deception. PTEC, by the way, is involved with, at the time of 9/11, 22 government computer systems. They just changed their name. It's called Agile Intel or something now. And they still control everything. And so like when I say to you, we easily could have a nuclear false flag, I'm not kidding. And it almost has to be something so big. The reason for that is since 9/11 and all the other false flags, people now are looking very, very closely, and now they are recording things and playing them back in slow motion. It's like this Virginia shooting, and they're looking real close. If you're going to do something, you're going to be a lot better than you were on 9/11. And in order to do that, it has to be something so shocking like a nuclear blast.
Yes, it has to be something that is so horrific, that would be such a collective trauma. That's the way the insiders would be thinking about this, that it has to be so traumatic that even the clear dissenters who understand what's happened would not be heard. I mean, this has to be a real threat. And it's got something to do with preparing for the worst, waking people up to the possibility of the worst, and hoping for the best, and realizing that if you are being guided in some extraordinary way, and it certainly does look like that from the outside, and I know that it kind of feels like that to you, then it means that there's hope. Then it means that there's a chance. Then it means that there's a real opportunity here and the game isn't lost. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that, and I believe that as much as there are bad forces, and it seems like they're overwhelming our planet, there are good forces. And I have to tell you, when I decided, actually wrote Methodical Illusion 2 years ago, and it sat on a shelf, and I didn't know what to do with it. I thought I would be a drone strike. I thought I'd be killed immediately. And last year at this time, right on the anniversary week of 9/11, I talked to a New York firefighter that has spent about a month on the piles looking for anyone in dead bodies and stuff. And when I asked him about the firefighters, and he told me that their bodies had been disintegrated, wasn't even dust left. They found some bunker gear and some breathing apparatus, but the human body, and I realized when I heard him say that what was used had so much heat and so much pressure to disintegrate a human body. I mean, you can just talk to somebody that does cremations and find out, and that creates ash. There was nothing left of these guys. And it inspired me. I'm not the FBI. Where are they? Where are they? That's what the Americans should be asking. Where the hell is the law enforcement? I'm just a retired flight attendant. Where in the hell is the FBI? The head of the DEA demeaned this gentleman that was concerned that we were finding Israeli spies and bomb experts running around trying to find these people in their offices and their homes. Where are they? Where are the law enforcement people? Where are our congressmen and senators?
There's a lot of standing down going on. It's continuing to this day.
Oh, yeah. And is it all for the love of money?
It's very hard to know, isn't it? One can guess, but we know that there are ways to persuade people to be silent, to persuade people to look the other way. There's a lot of blackmailing going on. I think you mentioned in one of your books something that was completely true, that it's so easy to plant things on someone's computer that would be convincingly incriminating. And it's just so simple to do this. It's almost like any official anywhere, if they're not willingly part of this whole setup, they can easily be leaned on to be silent.
And that's correct. And that can be done through that Promise software, which is now probably moved on to become version 3.0, 4.0, and probably is what we refer to now as PRISM. And that's what Edward Snowden was trying to point out to us. And the Promise software came out actually of the Phoenix Project in Vietnam in the mid-'80s, and it was stolen by the head of the Israeli Mossad from Edwin Meese at the Department of Justice under Reagan. They then started putting it into the embassies so they could spy on, through the computer systems, all of the embassies around the world. And also this is something that Indira Singh tried to bring up to Congress and to, I believe she worked for JP Morgan Chase, and she was a risk management person. And PTAC came in to do a demonstration for them. And she recognized the fact that there was a backdoor in their software, and then they could go in and they could empty your bank account, or they can plant children's pornography or any kind of stuff in your computer that they could adjust everything so that they can come after you as the IRS. By the way, that MITRE company, they're behind the IRS and healthcare and radar and all of the military industrial complex support companies.
They've got a finger in just about every single pie.
Yeah.
As far as I can see. The thing that's scary about Promise here is that this was operational over 30 years ago. What are the capabilities now? We can only imagine. They're probably more substantial than we can imagine.
It's extreme. Actually, they are now using computers to replace some of our generals and our decision makers, and the way they will be basically running the kill chain. So if a soldier wants to shoot someone, that decision will be made by a software computer in a computer now. So that artificial intelligence is where all this is going, and that's where I've been led to in researching all of this stuff that I found a lot of it. I just didn't put it in Methodical Deception. You can only give the reader so much, In Methodical Deception, I brought some things out we haven't talked about and that I put in the appendix that are going to be guaranteed eye-openers for people. And there'll be no doubt in anyone's mind this was very well planned out long before any aircraft took off, long before anything happened. And so you'll be able to see that in the appendix of the new book. And you can get that on Kindle if you're somewhere outside the United States or you're anxious to read it, and pull that down on a Kindle, read it on any electronic device. Don't miss the appendix.
Absolutely right. I'd just like to put in a plug there, because here's a reference to somebody who I know that you have a lot of respect for, and that's John B. Wells, who did an interview a little while ago with somebody who he called DJ. And here we're talking about the artificial intelligence capabilities that you just referred to. We're talking about the same thing here, aren't we?
That's correct. And I found pretty much everything she talked about. So when I heard her on with John B. Wells, I was like, yep, everything she said is true, because I've already found it through my 9/11 research, because all of these people that were somehow instrumental in 9/11 happening, whether they were phone tapping people, communication specialists, computer specialists, it doesn't matter. Their next phase is artificial intelligence. It's cataloging, it's monitoring, it's listening to everything. And if we don't stand up and start talking and shouting this from the rooftops, we will not have a voice because of this. And it is the near future. It's in effect right now, but it's the very near future. And it's a totalitarian, world dominant, one world government, new world order plan. And it's been a plan in place for quite a long time. And this is just going to sew it up. And yes, she's right on.
Thank you. That's a very appropriate end note. It feels to me, unless there's anything else that you'd like to pick up the talking stick and present to our audience here, it sort of feels like a wrap, and I'd really like to thank you for this. But is there anything else you want to say?
No, that's good for now. That's a lot of information for any listener, I have to say. So, one thing I can say is that they can contact me on any one of my websites. I have 3 of them now: methodicalillusion.com, methodicaldeception.com, and RebekahRoth.com, RebekahRoth.com. And there's an email button. All of those go directly to my private email box if you have anything you want to share, or someone else who does, share the book, share. One of the things that's cool is the book is waking people up that aren't conspiracy theorists, that just have that feeling they've been lied to across the country.
Very, very good job. Okay. I want to take my hat off to you. You're doing a fantastic job. And bless you for everything that you're doing. Bless you. Okay?
Well, thank you.
May you be protected, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Sugandham Pushtivartana